If I had known that asking my daughter-in-law for help getting to my chemotherapy appointment would end with me stranded at Newark Airport with a suitcase full of medical supplies and nowhere to go, I would have called a taxi instead. But when someone you trust looks you in the eye and says, "Don't worry, Mom, I've got you covered," you believe them. When they drive off and leave you sitting on a bench outside Terminal C while cancer eats away at your insides, that's when you realize family isn't always blood, and blood isn't always family. What happened next changed everything, and let me tell you, the woman who walked away from that airport wasn't the same one who'd been abandoned there. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sandra Miller, but everyone calls me Sandy. I'm 72 years old, and 3 months ago, I was diagnosed with stage 3 pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave me options. None of them particularly cheerful, but I chose to fight. What I didn't expect was that the hardest battle wouldn't be against the disease. It would be against the people I thought would stand by me. It started on a Tuesday morning in March. The cherry blossoms were just beginning to bloom outside my kitchen window in Montclair, New Jersey. When my phone rang, it was my son Marcus calling from his office in Manhattan, his voice strained in that way it gets when he's trying to sound casual about something that isn't casual at all. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something," he said, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. "Veronica and I have been discussing your situation, and we think it might be time to consider some changes." Your situation, not your cancer, not your treatment, not your health. Your situation, like I was a problem that needed solving rather than a person who needed support. I set down my coffee mug, the one with the faded inscription that read, "World's Best Grandma," that my grandson Tyler had given me for Christmas 2 years ago. Back when Veronica still let him visit, back when family dinners weren't negotiations, and holidays weren't battles over who had to take responsibility for the aging parent. "What kind of changes?" I asked, though I already suspected where this conversation was heading. "Well, the house is getting to be too much for you, isn't it? All those stairs, the maintenance, the yard work, and with the treatments," he trailed off, leaving the sentence hanging like a question mark in the air. The house, my house. The 4-bedroom colonial that his father and I had bought in 1978 when Marcus was just 2 years old. The house where we'd hosted his birthday parties, where he'd brought his first girlfriend, where I'd nursed his father through his final illness, where every room held 45 years of memories. "Too much for me. I'm managing just fine," I said, which wasn't entirely true, but wasn't entirely false either. The chemotherapy made me tired. Yes, and some days the nausea kept me in bed until noon, but I was managing. I had a routine, a support system through my church, neighbors who checked on me. What I didn't have was the energy to argue with my son about my living arrangements while I was fighting for my life. "Mom, be realistic. You missed your last 2 appointments because you couldn't drive yourself." Miss Henderson from next door called Veronica worried because she saw you fall in the driveway last week. I hadn't fallen. I'd stumbled slightly while carrying groceries, caught myself on the car door, and continued on my way. But apparently Miss Henderson's interpretation of events had made its way through the neighborhood telephone tree and landed in my daughter-in-law's lap, where it had been transformed into evidence of my declining capabilities. "I didn't fall," I said firmly, "and I only missed those appointments because of the snowstorm, and then because the car wouldn't start. I rescheduled them both." "That's exactly what I mean. You shouldn't have to worry about any of that. Veronica found this place, Sunset Manor. It's assisted living, but it's really nice. They have medical staff on site, transportation to appointments, activities. You'd have your own apartment, but with support when you need it." Sunset Manor. I'd driven past it once, a sprawling beige complex surrounded by perfectly manicured lawns and residents who sat on benches staring at nothing in particular. The kind of place where people went to wait. "I'm not ready for that," I said. "Mom, you have to be practical. What if you fall and no one finds you? What if you forget to take your medication? What if you have a reaction to the chemo and you're alone? What if, all the disasters that might happen? None of the life that was still happening. I was still gardening, Still reading, still volunteering at the food bank twice a week when I felt strong enough. I was still me, just me with cancer. I appreciate your concern, I said, using the tone I'd perfected during 30 years of teaching high school English, the one that meant this conversation is over, but I'm staying in my house. There was silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that feels like someone gathering ammunition. We'll talk about this later, he said finally. Veronica wanted me to remind you that Tyler has a soccer game this Saturday, if you're feeling up to it. If I was feeling up to it. As if my presence at my grandson's soccer game was conditional on my health status. As if I was a burden to be managed rather than a grandmother who wanted to watch her grandson play. But I said yes. Anyway, because I missed Tyler, missed the way he used to run to me after games with grass stains on his knees, and stories about every kick, every save, every moment of the match that had mattered to him. That Saturday I drove myself to the soccer field in Millburn, arriving early enough to claim a spot on the bleachers with a clear view of the field. I'd wrapped myself in layers, a sweater, a jacket, a wool scarf because the chemo had made me perpetually cold, and I'd brought a thermos of tea and a book in case the game started late. Tyler spotted me as his team warmed up and waved enthusiastically, his face breaking into the grin that reminded me so much of Marcus at that age. He jogged over to the fence separating the field from the stands. "Grandma Sandy, you came." "Of course I came. I wouldn't miss it." He looked around, then leaned closer to the fence. "Mom said you might not be able to make it because you're sick." The way he said it, cautious and careful, told me that Veronica had been talking to him about my cancer in ways that made it sound like I was dying tomorrow, which according to my oncologist wasn't necessarily true. Pancreatic cancer was serious, yes, but I was responding well to treatment. My tumors were shrinking, and my prognosis was cautiously optimistic. But optimism doesn't make for dramatic conversations about lifestyle changes and living arrangements. "I'm getting treatment to make me better," I told him. "Some days I don't feel great, but today I feel good enough to watch you play soccer." He grinned again and ran back to his team, and I settled in to watch the game, feeling more normal than I had in weeks. This was what I needed, not a room in Sunset Manor, but moments like this, connections to the life I'd built, reminders of why I was fighting so hard to stay in it. The game was close, Tyler's team winning by 1 goal in the final minutes, and I was gathering my things to leave when Veronica appeared at the bottom of the bleacher. She was perfectly put together as always, her blonde hair smooth despite the wind, her athletic wear coordinated in a way that suggested she'd never actually perspired in it. "Sandy," she said, not Mom or even Miss Miller, just my first name delivered with the kind of professional warmth she probably used with difficult clients at her real estate firm. "How are you feeling?" "Good," I said, which was true. The game had energized me, reminded me of all the reasons I wanted to keep fighting. "Tyler played beautifully." "He did." She glanced around, taking in the other parents who were packing up their lawn chairs and congratulating their children. "Marcus told me you two talked about Sunset Man, so we were doing this here in public with Tyler still within earshot, and other families around us. I should have expected it." Veronica had a talent for choosing moments when I couldn't react honestly without seeming unreasonable. "We talked," I said carefully. "I told him I'm not interested." "Sandy, I know change is scary, but you have to think about what's best for everyone. Marcus is beside himself with worry about you. He calls me 3 times a day asking if I've heard from you, if I think you're okay. It's affecting his work, his sleep. We want to help, but we can't do that if you won't let us." The implication was clear. My refusal to move into assisted living wasn't just stubborn, it was selfish. I was causing problems for Marcus, creating stress for their marriage, being difficult when they were only trying to help. "I understand your concern," I said, using my teacher voice again, "but I'm not ready to make that kind of change. I'm still capable of living independently. Are you?" She tilted her head slightly, her expression sympathetic but skeptical. "Because Miss Henderson mentioned that you seemed confused when she saw you last week. She said you were wearing your nightgown outside." I stared at her, speechless for a moment. I had been wearing my nightgown outside, under my coat, because I'd run out to get the newspaper early in the morning and hadn't bothered to get dressed first. It was 7 a.m. I was in my own driveway and I'd been outside for less than 2 minutes. But in Veronica's version of events, Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. It became evidence of confusion, of declining mental capacity, of a woman who could no longer be trusted to make rational decisions about her own life. "I was getting the paper," I said quietly, "in your nightgown, under my coat, at 7 in the morning, my own driveway." She nodded as if this explanation proved her point rather than refuted it. "Sandy, I know you don't want to hear this, but these little incidents add up. The missed appointments, the stumbling, the confusion about appropriate clothing. We're worried about you." Tyler appeared at her elbow, soccer ball tucked under his arm, grass stains on his uniform, and joy on his face. "Did you see my goal, Grandma Sandy?" "I saw it," I said, forcing a smile. "It was perfect. Can you come to dinner tomorrow? Mom's making her famous lasagna." I looked at Veronica, waiting for her to extend the invitation or make an excuse, but she just stood there, letting her 10-year-old son navigate the awkward social dynamics she'd created. "That sounds wonderful," I said. "What time?" 6, Tyler said before his mother could answer. "And maybe you can help me with my science project after dinner. It's about the solar system. I'd love to help with your science project." Veronica finally spoke. "Tyler, go put your gear in the car. Grandma Sandy might not be feeling well enough for dinner tomorrow." The careful way she said it, the emphasis on "might not be feeling well enough," told me everything I needed to know about how she planned to handle the invitation. She'd called tomorrow afternoon with apologies and concern, explaining that she'd talked to Marcus, and they thought it would be better if I rested, if I took care of myself, if I didn't overextend. But Tyler was already running toward their car, excited about dinner and science projects and time with his grandmother, so I just smiled and waved, and told myself that tomorrow I'd figure out how to navigate the minefield my family had become. I drove home slowly, taking the long way through the neighborhood I'd lived in for decades, past the elementary school where Marcus had learned to read, past the park where I'd pushed him on swings and taught him to ride a bike, past the houses of friends who'd raised their children alongside me and were now facing their own battles with aging and illness, and family members who meant well but understood little. My house looked the same as always when I pulled into the driveway: white shutters freshly painted, front garden beginning to show signs of spring, porch light glowing warmly in the gathering dusk. Home, not perfect anymore, not as easy to maintain as it once was, but the place where I belonged, where I was still myself rather than someone's medical condition or lifestyle problem. Inside, I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table with the stack of medical bills that seemed to grow larger every week. The insurance covered most of the treatment costs, but there were copays and deductibles and medications that added up to significant amounts. I'd been paying them out of my savings account, the one that held what was left of the life insurance settlement from when Robert died, plus my teacher's pension and Social Security. What Marcus and Veronica didn't know, what nobody knew except my accountant and my lawyer, was that the savings account they were worried about was just one of several. The bulk of my assets were tied up in investments that Robert had made decades ago, conservative stocks and bonds that had grown steadily over the year. When he died, I'd been too overwhelmed with grief to pay much attention to the financial details, letting the professionals handle everything while I focused on getting through each day. It wasn't until 2 years later, when I finally met with the financial advisor Robert had worked with, that I learned the full extent of what he'd left me. $8 million carefully invested and managed, generating enough income that I could live comfortably for the rest of my life without touching the principal. I could afford any treatment I needed, any care I wanted, any lifestyle I chose, but I'd never told Marcus about the money. Robert and I had raised him to be self-sufficient, to work for what he wanted, to understand the value of earning his own way in the world. When he graduated from college, we'd paid off his student loans as a gift, but after that, he was on his own. He'd built a successful career in finance, married Veronica, bought a house in an expensive suburb, sent Tyler to private school. He was doing well by any reasonable measure. The money was my safety net, my insurance against exactly the kind of vulnerability that Marcus and Veronica were trying to convince me I was experiencing. I could afford private care if I needed it, could hire nurses and drivers and housekeepers if my health deteriorated. I could pay for experimental treatments, or extended care, or anything else that might give me more time with the people I love. But I could also afford to make my own choices about how I wanted to live, and what I wanted was to stay in my house, in my neighborhood, connected to the life I'd built over 7 decades. The money gave me freedom, not from responsibility or difficulty, but from other people's opinions about what I should do with the time I had left. The phone rang as I was sorting through the bills, and I answered without checking the caller ID, expecting it to be one of my friends from church or maybe my sister calling from Florida. Instead, it was Veronica. "Sandy, I wanted to call about tomorrow night. Marcus and I have been talking, and we think it might be better if we postponed dinner." Here it was, exactly as I'd predicted, the manufactured concern, the careful suggestion that I wasn't well enough for a family dinner, the slow erosion of my connections to the people I loved most. "I'm feeling fine," I said. "Tyler is excited about working on his science project." "I know, and that's wonderful, but we're worried about exposing you to germs right now." Tyler came home with a bit of a sniffle, "And with your immune system compromised from the chemo." It was a reasonable excuse, medically sound, and difficult to argue with, except that Tyler had seemed perfectly healthy at the soccer game, and I'd been managing my immune system carefully for months, without becoming a hermit. "Is Tyler sick?" I asked. "Not sick exactly, just a little congested. We thought it would be better to be safe." "What did he say when you told him dinner was cancelled?" There was a pause, long enough for me to understand that Tyler didn't know yet, that this decision had been made without consulting the child who'd been looking forward to seeing his grandmother. "We'll explain it to him," Veronica said. "Maybe next weekend would be better. Maybe next weekend, which would become maybe the weekend after that, which would become maybe when I was feeling stronger, which would become maybe never." I'd seen this pattern before with other families, the gradual isolation disguised as protection, the slow withdrawal of normal life in the name of medical caution. "I understand," I said, because there was no point in arguing, no way to fight the reasonable-sounding excuses without seeming unreasonable myself. "I'm glad you understand. Marcus was worried you'd be upset." Of course he was. Better to let his wife make the difficult call, deliver the disappointing news, play the role of the practical one who had to make the hard decision. It was a dynamic I'd watched develop over the years of their marriage, Marcus increasingly passive, Veronica increasingly controlling, both of them convinced that their way of handling things was not just preferable but necessary. After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a long time, listening to the house settle around me, thinking about the conversation with Marcus earlier in the week, and the encounter with Veronica at the soccer game, and the cancelled dinner that was supposedly for my own good. There was a pattern emerging, a systematic effort to convince me that I was more fragile, more vulnerable, more in need of management than I actually was. I thought about the $8 million sitting in investment accounts, generating returns that I monitored quarterly but rarely. I thought about the power that money represented, not power over other people, but power over my own life, my own choices, my own future, and I thought about how that power meant nothing if I didn't use it to protect what mattered most to me. The next morning, I called my oncologist office and made an appointment for later in the week, not because I was having problems, but because I wanted documentation of my current condition, my prognosis, my cognitive status. If Marcus and Veronica were going to build a case for my incompetence, I wanted my own evidence to refute it. Then I called my lawyer David Rothstein, who'd been handling my affairs since Robert died. David was my age, a widower himself, and he understood the particular challenges of maintaining independence while managing serious illness. "Sandy," he said when his secretary put me through, "how are you feeling?" "Like I'm being managed instead of supported," I said, "and I need some advice about protecting myself." We talked for nearly an hour about my legal rights, about the difference between accepting help and surrendering autonomy, about the steps I could take to ensure that my medical and financial decisions remained my own. David suggested updating my advance directives, clarifying my wishes about treatment and care, and making sure that the people I wanted making decisions for me, if I became unable to do so, were actually the people I trusted most. "Is Marcus pressuring you about your living situation?" He and his wife think I should move to assisted living. They're worried about me living alone. "Are you worried about living alone?" I considered the question seriously. Was I worried about falling and not being found immediately? Yeah. About forgetting medication or missing appointments? Sometimes. About the practical challenges of maintaining a house while dealing with cancer treatment? Certain. But was I worried enough to give up my independence, my connection to the life I'd built, my right to make my own choices about how I wanted to spend whatever time I had left? No. I'm concerned about the practical challenges, I said, but I'm more concerned about losing my autonomy. Then let's make sure that doesn't happen. David explained the legal protections available to me, the documents I could put in place to ensure that my wishes were respected, the safeguards against anyone trying to override my decisions based on their assessment of my capacity. It was a conversation I probably should have had months ago, but better late than never. That afternoon, I drove to the medical center for my regular blood work, part of the monitoring routine that went along with chemotherapy. The parking garage was full, so I had to park several levels up and walk down, which left me slightly winded by the time I reached the oncology wing. I was sitting in the waiting room, catching my breath and reading a magazine, when I heard my name called, Mrs. Miller. I looked up to see a young woman in scrubs, holding a clipboard. Yes, could I speak with you for a moment? There's been some confusion about your emergency contact information. She led me to a small office behind the reception desk, where she pulled up my file on her computer screen. We received a call this morning from someone claiming to be your daughter-in-law, asking about your condition and your treatment schedule. When we told her we couldn't discuss your medical information without your consent, she became quite insistent. She said there were concerns about your ability to manage your own care. My chest tightened, not from exertion this time but from anger. Veronica had called my doctor's office, trying to get information about my condition, trying to insert herself into my medical care without my permission. I never authorized anyone to access my medical information, I said. That's what our records show, but she seemed to think she had some kind of authority. She mentioned something about power of attorney. I didn't have a power of attorney. I'd never signed any document giving anyone authority over my medical or financial decisions, but Veronica's confidence suggested that she either believed she had such authority, or was hoping the medical staff would assume she did. She has no authority, I said firmly. I'm perfectly capable of managing my own care. The young woman looked relieved. That's what we thought, but we wanted to check with you directly. Should we make a note in your file that she's not authorized to receive information? Yes, please. And please make sure everyone on your staff understands that I make my own medical decisions. Of course. Is there anyone you would like us to contact in case of emergency? I gave her my sister's information, and David Rothstein's, and my friend Margaret from church. People who would respect my choices rather than trying to override them, who would support my decisions rather than trying to make different ones for me. Walking back to my car, I felt the weight of what was happening settle over me like a heavy coat. This wasn't just family concern anymore. This was a systematic effort to undermine my autonomy, to create a paper trail of incompetence and confusion that could be used to justify taking control of my life. They didn't know about the money, didn't understand that I had resources, they couldn't imagine, didn't realize that their efforts to protect me from my own supposed limitations were actually threatening the very independence that the money was meant to preserve. But they were going to find out. That evening I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, and made a list of everything that had happened over the past few weeks: the pressure to move to assisted living, the canceled dinner, the call to my doctor's office, the casual mentions of incidents that had been twisted into evidence of decline. I was beginning to see the pattern clearly now, and I didn't like what I saw, but I was also beginning to see a path forward, a way to use the resources I had to protect the life I wanted to keep living. The phone rang as I was finishing my notes, and this time I checked the caller ID before answering. Marcus. Hi Mom, how are you feeling? Fine, I said, which was becoming my standard response to this question. How are you? Good. Listen, I wanted to talk to you about your next doctor's appointment. Veronica mentioned that you might want some company. Veronica had been busy, first calling my doctor's office without permission, now arranging to accompany me to appointments I was perfectly capable of handling myself. Marcus and Veronica weren't evil people. They weren't trying to hurt me, or steal from me, or deliberately make my life difficult. They genuinely believed they were trying to help, but their version of help looked like control, felt like diminishment, and threatened to strip away everything that made my life worth living. And I had the resources to stop them, if I was willing to use them. The next morning, I called David Rothstein again. David, I need to set up a meeting. I want to talk about leveraging my assets to protect my independence. What did you have in mind? Private care, if I need it. Home modifications if necessary. Legal protection against anyone trying to override my decisions. Whatever it takes to ensure that I can live on my own terms for as long as possible. How much are you willing to spend? I thought about the $8 million, growing quietly in investment accounts, while my son and daughter-in-law worried about my ability to manage my own life. Whatever it takes, I said. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, I'd met with David twice, updated all my legal documents, hired a private care coordinator who specialized in helping people with serious illnesses maintain their independence, and arranged for a home health aide to be available on call if I needed assistance. I'd also made arrangements for something else, something that Marcus and Veronica would discover soon enough. But first, there was the matter of my next chemotherapy appointment, scheduled for Monday morning at 9 a.m. I'd been dreading it, not because of the treatment itself, but because I knew Marcus and Veronica would try again to insert themselves into my medical care. I was right. Marcus called Sunday evening, his voice artificially casual, in the way that meant he was following a script Veronica had written. Mom, about tomorrow morning, I've rearranged my schedule so I can drive you to your appointment. That's not necessary. I'm perfectly capable of driving myself. I know you are, but wouldn't it be nice to have company? And Veronica thought she might come along too, just for moral support. Moral support from the woman who'd tried to access my medical records without permission, who'd convinced my son that I was confused and declining, who saw my cancer treatment as an opportunity to prove that I needed management rather than support. I don't need moral support, I said. I need to handle my own medical care. Mom, please, let us help. Let us be there for you. The pleading in his voice was real, and it broke my heart a little. He genuinely wanted to help, genuinely loved me, genuinely believed that accompanying me to chemotherapy was an act of care rather than control. But I also knew that Veronica would use the opportunity to speak to my oncologist, to ask questions about my prognosis and my cognitive status, to plant seeds of doubt about my ability to make informed decisions. I'll tell you what, if you want to help, you can drive me to the airport instead. The airport? Mom, what are you talking about? I'm going to visit Aunt Helen for a few weeks. I think a change of scenery will do me good. This was partly true. My sister Helen lived in Scottsdale, and I had been thinking about visiting her, but the airport trip I had planned for tomorrow was more complicated than a simple family visit. You can't travel during chemotherapy, Marcus said immediately. It's not safe. Dr. Peterson cleared me for travel last week. As long as I'm careful about timing it between treatments, there's no medical reason I can't go. This was also true. I'd discussed travel with my oncologist, not because I was planning to visit Helen, but because I wanted to know my options, wanted to understand what I could and couldn't do while managing my treatment. Mom, this is crazy. You can't just fly off to Arizona in the middle of cancer treatment. Why not? The question hung in the air between us, and I could almost hear him trying to formulate an answer that didn't sound controlling or patronizing. Because I was an adult, capable of making my own decisions about travel and treatment, and everything else. Because my cancer diagnosis didn't automatically make me incompetent or irresponsible. Because having family members who were worried about me didn't give them the right to dictate my choices. It's just sudden, he said finally. Impulsive. You usually plan things more carefully. I did plan it. I planned it very carefully. My next treatment isn't for 2 weeks, which gives me plenty of time to visit Helen and get back. What about your house? Your bills? Your appointments? All taken care of? There was another long silence, and I could hear him breathing. Could almost see him pacing around his kitchen while Veronica waited nearby for a report on how the conversation was going. If you're determined to do this, he said finally. At least let us drive you to the airport. And there it was. The offer I'd been waiting for, the opportunity I'd been hoping they'd give me. That would be lovely, I said. My flight is at 11 Monday morning. 11? But your chemo appointment is at 9. I canceled it. Rescheduled for when I get back. This wasn't true either. I'd rescheduled the appointment. But not because I was going to Arizona. I'd rescheduled it because I needed Monday morning for something else entirely. Something that was going to change the dynamic between Marcus, Veronica, and me in ways they couldn't imagine. Mom, you can't just cancel chemotherapy appointments. Your treatment schedule is important. 1 week won't make a difference, Dr. Peterson agreed. Another partial truth. Peterson had said that the timing of chemotherapy treatments had some flexibility, that occasionally rescheduling an appointment wouldn't significantly impact my overall treatment outcome, but he'd also emphasized the importance of staying on schedule whenever possible. Still, I wasn't actually missing treatment. I was just moving it to a different location. Okay, Marcus said, sounding defeated. Okay, we'll pick you up at 9. That'll give us plenty of time to get to Newark. Perfect. And Marcus, thank you. It means a lot to know I can count on you. This was completely true. Despite everything that had happened, despite the pressure and the manipulation and the systematic erosion of my autonomy, I did still love my son. I did still want to believe that underneath Veronica's influence, he was still the man I'd raised, still someone who would ultimately choose to support my choices rather than override them. Tomorrow, I'd find out if I was right. That night, I packed carefully, not for a trip to Arizona, but for something more complicated. I included my medical records, my insurance information, my identification, and a small suitcase with enough clothes for several days. I also packed something else, something that Marcus and Veronica had never seen and didn't know existed. The checkbook for my private investment account, the one connected to the $8 million they knew nothing about. I went to bed early, setting my alarm for 6 a.m. even though I didn't really need it. I'd been awake since 4, too anxious to sleep, too aware of everything that was about to change to find any rest. By 8:30, I was dressed and ready, my suitcase by the front door, my purse packed with everything I'd need for the day. I'd made coffee but couldn't drink it, made toast but couldn't eat. My stomach was tight with anticipation, and something that might have been fear but felt more like determination. At exactly 9 a.m., Marcus's car pulled into my driveway. I watched through the kitchen window as he got out of the driver's seat, and Veronica emerged from the passenger side. She was wearing a black wool coat and sunglasses, her hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, her expression serious in the way that suggested she was preparing for something more significant than a simple airport drop-off. The knock on my door was gentle, tentative. Mom, we're here. I opened the door with my coat already on, my purse over my shoulder, my suitcase in my hand. Ready, I said. Veronica smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Sandy, are you sure about this trip? It seems so sudden, and with everything you're dealing with. I'm sure, I said, lifting my suitcase slightly to show I was ready to go. Helen is expecting me. We walked to the car in silence, Marcus taking my suitcase and placing it in the trunk while Veronica held the passenger door open for me. I noticed she'd chosen to sit in the back, leaving me in the front seat beside Marcus. Smart positioning. It would allow her to observe my behavior, to watch for signs of confusion or poor judgment that she could catalog for future discussions about my declining capability. The drive to Newark took 45 minutes in morning traffic, and for the first half hour, the conversation was carefully neutral. Marcus asked about Helen, about her health and her apartment in Scottsdale. I answered easily, sharing details about my sister's retirement community, her volunteer work at the local library, her recent hip replacement surgery that had gone well. How long has it been since you've seen her? Veronica asked from the back seat. Christmas, I said. She came here for the holidays, before your diagnosis. It wasn't a question, just a statement designed to remind everyone in the car that my cancer diagnosis had changed everything, that the person who'd hosted Christmas dinner 3 months ago was somehow fundamentally different from the person sitting in the passenger seat now. Yes, before my diagnosis, but we talk every week. She knows exactly what's going on with my treatment. Does she know you're coming? I turned to look at Veronica, taking in her perfectly applied makeup, her expensive earrings, her expression of concerned skepticism. Of course she knows I'm coming. Do you think I just show up at airports and hope for the best? Marcus cleared his throat, the way he did when he was uncomfortable with the direction a conversation was taking. Mom, Veronica's just making sure you've thought everything through. I've thought everything through very carefully. The truth was, I had thought everything through, just not in the way they imagined. Helen did know I was coming, but not today. I'd called her yesterday to let her know I might visit in the next few weeks, depending on how some family situations developed. She'd been delighted at the prospect and told me to come whenever I was ready, but today's trip to the airport wasn't about visiting Helen. Today was about something else entirely. What airline are you flying? Veronica asked. Southwest, I said, which was true. I did have a Southwest reservation, though not for today's flight. And you have your boarding pass? I'll get it at the airport. I prefer to check in at the counter. This seemed to satisfy her, or at least she stopped asking questions. Marcus turned on the radio, finding a classical music station that filled the car with soft string arrangements, and we drove the rest of the way in relative peace. Newark Airport was busy even on a Monday morning, the departure level crowded with travelers dragging suitcases and checking their phones. Marcus pulled up to the Southwest terminal and put the car in park. Do you want us to come in with you? He asked. Help you get checked in? That's not necessary. I know how to navigate an airport. But Veronica was already getting out of the car, already walking around to help me with my suitcase, already assuming that I needed assistance. I hadn't asked for. It's no trouble, she said. We want to make sure you get to your gate safely, so we walked into the terminal together, Marcus on one side of me, Veronica on the other, my suitcase rolling behind us like a pet on a leash. The Southwest check-in counter was busy, with several lines of passengers waiting to drop off bags and print boarding passes. Which line should we get in? Marcus asked, looking around at the various signs and display. Actually, I said, stopping near a cluster of chairs in the waiting area, I need to make a phone call first. Why don't you two grab some coffee? This might take a few minutes. They exchanged a look, the kind of quick glance that passes between married couples when they're communicating without words. The look said, should we leave her alone? Is this safe? What if she gets confused? We can wait, Veronica said. There's no rush. Please, I said, using the tone I'd perfected during 30 years of classroom management, the one that brooked no argument. I need some privacy for this call. Marcus nodded reluctantly. Okay, we'll be right over there at Starbucks. Take your time. I watched them walk away, Veronica's heels clicking on the terminal floor, Marcus's shoulders slightly hunched in the way that suggested he was uncomfortable with the whole situation. When they were out of sight, I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I'd memorized but never called before. Meridian Air Medical Services, a professional voice answered. This is Jessica. This is Sandra Miller. I have a reservation for an 11 a.m. departure. Yes, Mrs. Miller. Let me pull up your file. You're traveling to Sloan Kettering in New York for medical consultation? That's correct. And you'll be accompanied by our medical staff for the duration of the flight? Yes. Perfect. We're ready for you. Please proceed to Gate 47 in Terminal B. That's just past Security Checkpoint 3. Dr. Martinez will meet you there at 10:30. I thanked her and hung up, then sat in the plastic chair for a moment, watching the normal chaos of commercial aviation swirl around me. Families heading to vacations, business travelers checking their laptops, elderly couples moving slowly through security lines with patience born of experience. None of them knew that I was about to do something that would completely change my relationship with my son and daughter-in-law. None of them knew that I was carrying a checkbook connected to $8 million, or that I was about to use that money to prove a point that couldn't be made any other way. Marcus and Veronica returned 15 minutes later, carrying paper cups of coffee and looking slightly more relaxed than they had when we'd arrived. How was your call? Marcus asked. Fine, everything's confirmed. Good, Veronica said. Should we head to security now? Actually, there's been a small change of plans. They both froze, coffee cups halfway to their lips, expressions shifting from relaxed to alert in the space of a heartbeat. What kind of change? Marcus asked carefully. I'm not flying Southwest today. I'm taking a different flight. What do you mean, a different flight? Mom, we can't just change airlines at the last minute. You'd have to buy a new ticket, and they might not have seats available, and it's already arranged, I said calmly. I have a reservation on a medical transport flight. The silence that followed was deafening. Around us, the airport continued its normal operations, announcements over the intercom, travelers hurrying past with their luggage, the distant sound of jets taking off and landing, but in our small circle of plastic chairs, everything had stopped. A medical transport flight, Veronica repeated slowly, as if she was testing each word to make sure she'd heard correctly. Yes, to Sloan Kettering in New York, for a second opinion. Marcus set his coffee cup down, so hard that liquid splashed onto his hand. Sloan Kettering. Mom, what are you talking about? Dr. Peterson is an excellent oncologist. You don't need a second opinion. I want a second opinion about my treatment options, my prognosis, my ability to continue living independently while managing my care. Veronica leaned forward, her voice taking on the patient, condescending tone she used when she thought someone wasn't understanding something important. Sandy, medical transport flights are for people who are too sick to fly commercially. They're for patients who need medical supervision during travel. I know what they're for, but you don't need medical supervision. You're perfectly capable of flying on a regular airline. I looked at her steadily, letting the irony of her words settle in the air between us. For weeks, she and Marcus had been arguing that I wasn't capable of managing my own care, that I needed supervision and assistance with basic decisions about my living situation and my medical treatment. But now, when I was taking exactly the kind of precautionary medical step they should have supported, suddenly I was perfectly capable. I thought you believed I needed more medical supervision, I said quietly. Marcus ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was frustrated and didn't know how to solve a problem. Mom, this doesn't make sense. Why didn't you tell us about this? Why the secrecy? There's no secrecy. I'm telling you now. But you let us drive you here thinking you were taking a commercial flight to visit Aunt Helen. I never said I was visiting Aunt Helen today. You assumed that. Veronica stood up abruptly, pacing in the small space between the chairs, her heels clicking with agitation. This is exactly what we've been worried about. The confusion, the poor decision-making, the lack of communication. Sandy, you can't just arrange medical transport flights without talking to your family. I can arrange whatever medical care I think is appropriate. I'm still legally competent to make my own medical decisions. Are you? The question came from Marcus, quiet but pointed, and it hung in the air like a challenge. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised from infancy, who'd called me every week for 30 years just to check in, who'd brought me flowers on Mother's Day, and called me when he was promoted and asked my advice about everything from job changes to mortgage rate. This man who was now questioning my mental competence because I'd arranged for medical care without asking his permission. Yes, I said firmly, I am. Then why are you acting so strangely? Why all the elaborate arrangements? Why not just tell us what you were planning? I could have explained then, could have told them about the money, about the resources that gave me options they couldn't imagine, about the legal protections I'd put in place and the private care I'd arranged. Could have shown them the checkbook in my purse and the bank statements that proved I could afford any medical care I wanted, any level of independence I chose to maintain. Instead, I stood up and picked up my suitcase, because I wanted to see what you would do. I wanted to see whether you would support my choices, or try to override them. I wanted to know whether you saw me as a person capable of making my own decisions, or as a problem that needed to be managed. Mom, Marcus started, but I held up my hand. I have a flight to catch. Doc Martinez is waiting for me at gate 47. I started walking toward the security checkpoint, my suitcase rolling behind me, my heart pounding but my steps steady. Behind me, I could hear Marcus and Veronica following, their voices raised in urgent conversation. This is insane, Veronica was saying. We can't let her get on some random medical flight by herself. What if something happens? What if she gets confused? What if— Mom, wait, Marcus called. Please, let's talk about this. I stopped and turned around, facing them both in the middle of the busy terminal. Other travelers moved around us, some glancing curiously at the family drama unfolding near the security entrance, but most too focused on their own journeys to pay attention to ours. There's nothing to talk about, I said. I'm going to New York to get a second opinion about my cancer treatment. It's a reasonable, responsible thing to do, but why didn't you include us in the planning? Marcus asked. We could have helped. We could have researched doctors, made recommendations. Like you helped when you called my oncologist office trying to get information about my condition. Veronica's face flushed red. I was trying to understand what we're dealing with. How are we supposed to help if we don't have all the information? You're not supposed to help by going behind my back and trying to access my private medical records. We're your family, Marcus said, his voice rising slightly. We love you. We want what's best for you. What's best for me is making my own decisions about my own life, even when those decisions don't make sense. The question came from Veronica, sharp and challenging, and it cut straight to the heart of everything that had been building between us for months. Who decides whether my decisions make sense? I asked. You, based on what authority, based on what expertise about my life, my values, my priority. Based on the fact that you're sick, she said bluntly. Based on the fact that cancer affects judgment, that chemotherapy causes cognitive changes, that people in your situation often need help thinking clearly about complex decisions. There it was, finally stated openly. The assumption that had been driving all of their behavior, all of their pressure, all of their systematic undermining of my autonomy. Because I had cancer, I couldn't be trusted to make rational decisions. Because I was undergoing chemotherapy, my judgment was compromised. Because I was older and sick, I needed other people to think for me. My cognitive function has been tested, I said calmly. Multiple times, by multiple doctors. I'm completely competent to make my own decisions. But you're not making good decisions, Marcus said desperately. Mom, please, just listen to us. This whole thing, the secrecy, the elaborate medical transport, the sudden trip to New York. It's not like you, it's impulsive and expensive and unnecessary. Expensive. That was interesting. Marcus was worried about the cost of a medical transport flight, worried that I was spending money unwisely, making financial decisions that demonstrated poor judgment. If only he knew. I can afford it, I said simply. Mom, I know you have some savings, but medical transport flights cost thousands of dollars, and if insurance doesn't cover it because it's not medically necessary, I said I can afford it. Something in my tone must have penetrated his worry, because he stopped talking and looked at me more carefully. Behind him, Veronica was checking her phone, probably looking up information about medical transport costs, or trying to figure out how to contact my doctor, or researching legal options for stopping an elderly parent from making poor financial decisions. Gate 47, I said. Terminal B. If you want to walk me there, you're welcome to. If you want to stay here and discuss my judgment and my decision-making capabilities, that's fine too. But I'm getting on that flight. I turned and walked toward security, fishing my ID and boarding pass out of my purse as I approached the checkpoint. The boarding pass was crisp and official-looking, with the Meridian Air medical logo and my flight information clearly printed. Gate 47, departing at 11:00 a.m., destination Teterboro Airport, New Jersey, with ground transport to Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. The TSA agent looked at my documents, compared my face to my driver's license photo, and waved me through. Behind me, I could hear Marcus explaining to someone that his mother was about to board a medical transport flight, and asking whether family members were allowed to accompany patients. I didn't wait to hear the answer. I walked through the metal detector, collected my purse and shoes, and headed toward Terminal B, following the signs and moving walkways toward gate. The gate area was smaller than those used for commercial flights, with only a few dozen seats and a desk staffed by a single Meridian Air employee. A man in a white coat was standing near the window, looking out at the tarmac where a small jet waited, its engines already running. Mrs. Miller? He approached with a warm smile and an extended hand. I'm Dr. Martinez. I'll be your attending physician for today's flight. Thank you for accommodating the last-minute arrangements. No problem at all. We specialize in providing medical transport for patients who need specialized care during travel. I understand you're going to Sloan Kettering for consultation about your pancreatic cancer treatment. That's correct. He glanced past me toward the gate entrance, where Marcus and Veronica had appeared, looking harried and out of place among the calm efficiency of the medical transport operation. "Are those family members?" Dr. Martinez asked quietly. "My son and daughter-in-law. Are they traveling with you today?" I looked back at Marcus and Veronica, who were standing near the gate desk, talking urgently with the Meridian Air employee. Marcus looked worried and confused. Veronica looked angry and determined. "No," I said. "They're not traveling with me." Martinez nodded professionally. "Would you like to speak with them before we board?" "We have a few minutes before departure." I considered this. Part of me wanted to maintain the wall I'd built, to board the plane without another word and let them figure out for themselves what had just happened. But another part of me, the part that remembered holding Marcus as a baby and teaching him to ride a bike and helping him with his homework, wanted to give him one more chance to understand. "Yes," I said, "I'd like to speak with them." Martinez stepped discreetly away as Marcus and Veronica approached. Up close, Marcus looked younger than his 37 years, his face pale with worry and confusion. Veronica looked like a woman preparing for battle, her jaw set and her eyes sharp with determination. "Mom," Marcus said, "the woman at the desk says this flight costs $18,000. $18,000 for a 2-hour trip to New York. Please tell me you didn't actually pay for this." I reached into my purse and pulled out my checkbook, the one connected to the investment account they knew nothing about. I opened it to show them the recent transaction record, the check I'd written to Meridian Air Medical Services 3 days ago. $18,000, paid in full. Marcus stared at the checkbook, his eyes moving from the check register to the account balance printed at the top of each page. 8 digits, a number so large that it took him several seconds to process what he was seeing. "Mom," he said quietly, "what is this?" "It's my money," I said simply. "Money your father invested years ago. Money I've never touched because I never needed to touch it. Money that gives me the freedom to make my own choices about my medical care, my living situation, and my life." Veronica grabbed the checkbook from Marcus's hands, staring at the balance as if it might change if she looked at it hard enough. $8 million? She whispered. 8.3 million, as of last quarter. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences, deeper and more profound. This wasn't the silence of worry or confusion, or even anger. This was the silence of people realizing that everything they thought they knew about a situation was wrong. "You've had $8 million this whole time?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible. "Yes. And you never told us?" "No." I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to be independent and self-sufficient, who'd built his own successful career and never asked me for financial help, who'd been worried about my ability to manage my own affairs while I sat on resources that could have solved any problem he could imagine. "Because I wanted to know who you really were," I said. "I wanted to know whether you loved me or whether you loved what you thought you could get from me. I wanted to know whether you would support my choices when you thought I was a confused old woman with limited resources, or whether your concern was really about something else. Mom, that's not fair. We were trying to help. You were trying to control me. There's a difference." Veronica was still staring at the checkbook, her face cycling through a series of emotions I couldn't quite identify. Shock, certainly. Anger, possibly. Something that might have been shame or might have been calculation. "All this time," she said slowly, "you've been living like you're on a fixed income, shopping with coupons, driving that old car, worrying about medical bills." "I wasn't worrying about medical bills. You were worrying about medical bills, but you let us think you needed help. You let us worry about your finances." "I never asked you to worry about my finances. I never asked you to manage my money or plan my future or make decisions about what I could and couldn't afford." Dr. Martinez appeared at my elbow, politely but firmly interrupting the family conference. "Miss Miller, we need to board now if we're going to make our appointment slot at Sloan Kettering." I looked at Marcus and Veronica one more time, taking in their shocked faces, their obvious confusion about how to process what they'd just learned. I'll be back in a few days. When I return, we can talk about how our relationship is going to work going forward. But it's going to work differently than it has been. Marcus reached out as if to stop me, then let his hand drop to his side. Mom, I don't understand any of this. I know you don't. But you. I walked toward the gate, following Dr. Martinez toward the small jet that would take me to New York, to one of the best cancer centers in the world, to a consultation I could afford without thinking twice about the cost. Behind me I could hear Veronica's voice, sharp with something that sounded like anger but might have been fear. She planned this whole thing, the fake trip to Arizona, the airport drop-off, the dramatic reveal. She manipulated us. I paused at the gate door and looked back one more time. I learned from the best, I said. The flight to Taterboro took exactly 97 minutes. Martinez was professional and attentive, checking my vital signs, asking about my symptoms and my current treatment regimen, making notes in a medical chart that would be forwarded to the Sloan Kettering team. But I stared out the small window at the landscape passing below, highways and suburbs and industrial complexes, the ordinary geography of lives being lived by people who had no idea that somewhere above them, a 72-year-old woman was flying toward a confrontation with the best oncologist money could buy, carrying a checkbook that could purchase any treatment they recommended. The consultation at Sloan Kettering lasted 4 hours. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the pancreatic cancer specialist I'd requested, reviewed my medical records, examined me thoroughly, ordered additional blood work, and spent nearly an hour discussing my treatment options. Her assessment was cautiously optimistic. My current treatment protocol was excellent, she said. Dr. Peterson in New Jersey was providing state-of-the-art care, and my response to chemotherapy was better than average for someone with my diagnosis. There were experimental treatments available if my condition changed, clinical trials I could qualify for if needed, surgical options that might become viable if my tumors continued to shrink. But most importantly, from my perspective, she saw no evidence of cognitive decline, no reason why I couldn't continue making my own medical decisions, no indication that I needed supervision or management of my care. Your mental status is completely normal, she said, making notes in my chart. Your understanding of your condition is sophisticated and accurate. Your questions are informed and appropriate. I see no reason why you couldn't continue living independently and managing your own treatment, assuming you have adequate support systems in place. What kind of support system? Access to emergency care if needed, transportation to appointments if driving becomes difficult, home health services if you experience complications. But those are practical accommodations, not evidence of incompetence. I thought about the care coordinator I'd hired, the home health aide on call, the legal protections David Rothstein had put in place. I have those things arranged. Then you should be fine to continue living as you choose. On the flight back to Newark, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace, not the absence of worry. I still had cancer, still faced an uncertain future, still had relationships to repair or sever, but the peace that comes from having your judgment validated by experts, your choices confirmed as reasonable, your autonomy respected by people who actually understood your situation. Dr. Martinez accompanied me back to Newark, where a car service was waiting to drive me home to Montclair. It was nearly 8 p.m. when I walked through my front door, nearly 12 hours since Marcus and Veronica had picked me up for what they thought was a trip to visit my sister. The house felt different somehow, quieter but not lonely, empty but not abandoned. It felt like a place where I belonged, where I could continue to live on my own terms for as long as my health and my choices allowed. I was making tea when the phone rang. Marcus, Mom? Are you okay? Are you home? I'm home. I'm fine. How was your appointment? I could hear the careful way he asked the question, as if he wasn't sure whether he had the right to know the answer, wasn't sure what our relationship looked like now that everything had changed. Informative. Chin confirmed that my current treatment is appropriate, and that my prognosis is cautiously optimistic. That's good. That's really good. Yes. There was a long silence, filled with all the things we weren't saying, All the conversations we'd need to have about trust and autonomy and the ways that money changes everything, even when you don't want it to. Mom, about today, about the money. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything tonight. We'll talk when you're ready. Are you angry? About us trying to, about the way we've been? I thought about the question seriously. Was I angry? About the pressure to move to assisted living? About the attempts to access my medical records? About the systematic undermining of my autonomy disguised as concern? I'm disappointed, I said finally, but not angry. You thought you were helping. We were helping. We were trying to help. I know you were, but you were trying to help someone who didn't need the kind of help you were offering. Another silence. Longer this time. Mom, what happens now? I looked around my kitchen at the bills stacked neatly on the counters, at the medical appointment cards attached to the refrigerator with magnets, at the ordinary evidence of a life being lived independently despite cancer, despite age, despite other people's assumptions about what I could and couldn't handle. Now I continue living my life, I said, and you decide whether you want to be part of that life, or part of the problem. I hung up gently, not in anger but in finality. Tomorrow there would be more conversations, more decisions, more negotiations about how our family would function going forward. Tomorrow I would probably hear from Veronica, demanding explanations, or making accusations, or trying to find a way to spin what had happened into evidence that I was manipulative rather than resourceful. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, in my own house, drinking my own tea, making my own choices about my own life, with $8 million in the bank, and the best medical care money could buy, and the absolute certainty that no one would ever again mistake my kindness for weakness or my cancer for incompetence. Tonight, I was The next morning brought rain, a steady drizzle that turned the world outside my kitchen window gray and soft. I was sitting at the table with my second cup of coffee, reading the medical report Dr. Chen had given me, when I heard a car door slam in my drive. Through the window I watched Veronica march up my front walkway, her heels clicking against the wet pavement, her black umbrella held like a weapon against the weather. She moved with purpose, the kind of determined stride that suggested she'd spent the night planning this conversation, and wasn't going to be deterred by pleasantries or politeness. I didn't hurry to answer the door when she knocked. I finished reading the paragraph about treatment protocols, took another sip of coffee, and only then walked slowly to the front hall. When I opened the door, Veronica was standing on my porch with rain dripping from her umbrella, and fury radiating from every line of her body. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. "Good morning, Veronica. Would you like some coffee?" She stepped past me into the hall without waiting for an invitation, shaking rain from her umbrella, and setting it in the corner with the kind of sharp movements that suggested barely controlled anger. "I don't want coffee. I want answers." I closed the door and turned to face her, taking in her appearance. She was dressed for business in a charcoal suit and low heels, her hair pulled back severely, her makeup perfect despite the early hour and the rain. She looked like a lawyer preparing for court, or a real estate agent about to deliver bad news to difficult clients. "What kind of answers? Don't play games with me, Sandy. You know exactly what I'm talking about." I walked back toward the kitchen, leaving her to follow or not as she chose. She followed, her heels sharp against my hardwood floors, her presence filling my peaceful morning space with tension and accusation. $8 million, she said, settling into the chair across from me at the kitchen table. $8 million that you never mentioned while we've been discussing your finances, your living situation, your ability to manage your own affairs. It never came up in conversation. It never came. Her voice rose slightly, then she caught herself and lowered it again, apparently remembering that she was a guest in my house and needed to maintain some pretense of civility. "Sandy, we've been worried sick about your medical bills, about whether you could afford your treatments, about the financial burden of maintaining this house. I never asked you to worry about those things. You never told us we didn't need to worry about them." I considered this accusation, turning it over in my mind like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit where she was trying to place it. Was I obligated to share my financial information with my son and daughter-in-law to spare them unnecessary work? Was keeping my assets private a form of deception, or was their assumption that I was financially vulnerable a form of presumption? My finances are private, I said finally. I'm not required to discuss my assets with anyone, not even your family, especially not my family, if my family is using my supposed financial limitations as justification for overriding my personal choices. Veronica leaned back in her chair, studying me with the calculating expression I'd seen her use when evaluating properties for potential buyers. She was reassessing, recalibrating, trying to figure out how this new information changed the dynamics between us. So yesterday was what, exactly? Some kind of test? You could call it that. You deliberately let us think you were making a poor financial decision, taking an expensive and unnecessary medical transport, just to see how we'd react. I wanted to see whether you'd support my choices or try to override them. And what's your conclusion? I thought about the scene at the airport, about Marcus's obvious distress when he learned the cost of the medical transport, about Veronica's immediate assumption that I was spending money unwisely and making decisions that demonstrated poor judgment. My conclusion is that you see me as incompetent when you think I have limited resources, and manipulative when you discover I have significant resources. Either way, you don't see me as a capable adult making reasonable decisions about my own life. She was quiet for a moment, her fingers drumming against the table, her eyes focused somewhere beyond my shoulder. When she spoke again, her voice was more controlled, more careful. That's not fair. We were trying to help. Help with what, exactly? Help with planning for your future. Help with making sure you're safe and cared for. Help with managing the practical challenges of aging, while dealing with a serious illness. I didn't ask for help with any of those things, but you need help with them. Sandy, you have cancer. You're 72 years. You live alone in a house that's too big for you, and you're dealing with treatments that make you tired and sick. Those are objective facts, regardless of how much money you have in the bank. There it was again, the underlying assumption that cancer plus age plus living alone equaled incompetence, that my diagnosis automatically made me incapable of managing my own affairs. The money hadn't changed her fundamental assessment of my capabilities. It had just changed her strategy for dealing with what she saw as my limitations. Having cancer doesn't make me mentally incompetent, I said quietly. Being 72 doesn't make me incapable of making rational decisions. Living alone doesn't make me helpless, but it does make you vulnerable. To what? To accidents, to emergencies, to making decisions without having all the information or understanding all the consequences. I stood up and walked to the counter, refilling my coffee cup and offering the pot to Veronica, who shook her head impatiently. I was buying time, trying to figure out how to navigate this conversation without losing my temper or saying something I'd regret later. Veronica, I said, returning to the table, what do you want from me? The question seemed to catch her off guard. She blinked, tilted her head slightly, and for the first time since she'd arrived, looked uncertain about how to respond. I want you to be realistic about your situation. I am being realistic. I have a serious illness that I'm treating aggressively with the best medical care available. I have resources that allow me to access any level of care I might need. I have legal protections in place to ensure my wishes are respected. What about that is unrealistic? The isolation, the secrecy, the refusal to let people who love you help with planning and decision-making. What you call isolation, I call privacy. What you call secrecy, I call maintaining appropriate boundaries. What you call refusal to let people help, I call maintaining my autonomy. She leaned forward, her expression intense. But what happens when you can't maintain your autonomy? What happens when the cancer progresses, or when you fall and break a hip, or when you become confused from medications? What happens when you need someone to make decisions for you? I have legal documents in place for those situations. I have people designated to make decisions for me if I become incapable of making them myself. Who? The question was sharp, almost demanding, and it told me everything I needed to know about why she was really here. This wasn't about my health or my safety or my well-being. This was about control, about who would have authority over my assets if something happened to me, about ensuring that she and Marcus were positioned to manage my affairs if I became unable to manage them myself. My lawyer, my doctor, and my sister, I said, people who will respect my wishes, rather than substituting their judgment for mine. Not Marcus, not Marcus, not Marcus. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Veronica understood exactly what I was telling her, that I didn't trust her, or my son to respect my choices, that I deliberately excluded them from any decision-making authority, that the discovery of my assets hadn't changed my assessment of their trustworthiness. Sandy, that's incredibly hurtful. Marcus is your son, he loves you. I know he loves me. But love and respect are different things. Marcus may love me, but he doesn't respect my judgment or my autonomy. He respects you. No, he doesn't. He patronizes me. He worries about me. He wants to protect me. But he doesn't respect my right to make my own choices, even when those choices involve risk or uncertainty. Veronica stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and staring out at the rain. When she spoke again, her voice was tight with frustration. You're being incredibly unfair. We've done nothing but try to support you through a difficult time. You've tried to control me through a difficult time. There's a difference. How is worrying about your safety controlling you? When you use your worry as justification for overriding my decisions, it becomes control. She turned to face me, and for the first time since she'd arrived, I saw something that might have been genuine emotion in her expression. Not anger or frustration, but something closer to hurt or confusion. I don't understand how we got here, she said quietly. 6 months ago, we had a good relationship. You came to Tyler's games, we had family dinners. We talked about normal things. Now everything feels like a battle. I considered her words, thinking back to 6 months ago, before my diagnosis, before the conversations about assisted living and medical management, and all the ways my life needed to change to accommodate other people's anxiety about my future. 6 months ago, you didn't see me as a problem that needed solving, I said. You saw me as Tyler's grandmother and Marcus's mother, and a person in my own right. Now you see me as a collection of risk factors and limitations that need to be managed. That's not true, isn't it? When was the last time you asked me about my garden or my book club, or my volunteer work at the food bank? When was the last time we had a conversation about anything other than my health, my living situation, or my ability to manage my own affairs? She was quiet, apparently thinking about this question, apparently realizing that I was right. Your health is important, she said finally. It affects everything else. My health is one aspect of my life. It's not the only aspect, and it's not the most important aspect. How can you say that? You have cancer, I have cancer, and I'm treating it, and I'm living my life while I treat it. The cancer doesn't define me, or limit me, or make me incapable of continuing to be myself. Veronica returned to the table, sitting down heavily, and looking suddenly tired. For the first time since she'd arrived, she looked like someone who was genuinely struggling with a difficult situation, rather than someone who was angry about losing an argument. Sandy, I'm scared, she said quietly. I'm scared that something will happen to you, and we won't know about it until it's too late. I'm scared that you'll make a decision that puts you in danger, and we won't be able to help. I'm scared that we'll lose you because we weren't paying close enough attention. It was the most honest thing she'd said since arriving, and it caught me off guard. Not because I hadn't known she was scared, but because she'd finally admitted it directly, without wrapping it in concern about my judgment or my capabilities. I understand being scared, but your fear doesn't give you the right to manage my life. But what if we're right? What if you are taking unnecessary risks, making poor decisions, missing signs that you need more help? Then I'll deal with the consequences of my choices, the same way I've been dealing with the consequences of my choices for 72 years. What if the consequences are serious? What if you fall and no one finds you for days? What if you have a medical emergency and can't get help? What if you become confused and make dangerous mistakes? I looked at Veronica across my kitchen table, this woman who'd married my son and become part of my family, who genuinely believed she was protecting me from dangers I was too stubborn or too confused to recognize. She wasn't evil or malicious or greedy. She was scared and controlling and convinced that her way of managing risk was the only reasonable approach. Then I'll have lived as myself until I couldn't anymore, I said, which is better than living as your version of me, starting now. She stared at me for a long moment, apparently trying to process this idea, apparently struggling to understand how someone could choose autonomy over safety, dignity over security. That's a terrible way to think about it, she said finally. It's my way of thinking about it, and it's my life to think about. The conversation might have continued, might have circled back to the same arguments, and the same fundamental disagreements, about risk and autonomy, and the obligations of family members to protect each other from their own choices. But before Veronica could respond, my phone rang. I glanced at the caller ID, and saw David Rostein's office number. I need to take this, I said, standing and walking toward the living room, for privacy. Mrs. Miller, David's secretary said when I answered. Mr. Rostein would like to schedule a meeting with you this week. He says it's regarding the protective measures you discussed last week. What kind of protective measure? Legal protections against anyone attempting to challenge your competency, or your right to make your own medical and financial decisions. He's drafted some additional documents for your review. I glanced back toward the kitchen, where Veronica was sitting at my table, probably listening to my end of the conversation, probably trying to figure out what new legal maneuvers I was implementing to maintain my independence. Schedule it for tomorrow morning, I said. 10 a.m. Perfect. And Mrs. Miller? Mr. Rostein wanted me to mention that if anyone has been pressuring you about your living situation or your medical care, those conversations could be relevant to the protective measures he's implementing. I understood. I hung up and returned to the kitchen, where Veronica was checking her phone and looking like she was preparing to leave. Legal protections? She asked without looking up. Routine estate planning update. Is that what you call it when you're making sure your family can't help you even if you need help? It's what I call making sure my wishes are respected even if other people disagree with them. She stood up, gathering her purse and walking toward the front hall to retrieve her umbrella. At the door she paused and turned back to face me. Sandy, I want you to know that everything we've done, everything we've suggested, has been motivated by love and concern for your welfare. I believe, but I also want you to know that if you continue down this path, if you continue to shut us out and refuse our help and make decisions without consulting us, there may come a time when we feel we have no choice but to take more formal steps to protect you. The threat was delivered quietly, almost gently, but it was unmistakably a threat. More formal steps could only mean one thing: legal action to challenge my competency, to have me declared unable to manage my own affairs, to transfer authority over my medical and financial decisions to someone else. I understand, I said calmly, and I want you to know that I've taken steps to protect myself against exactly that kind of interference. We looked at each other across my front hall, two women who'd started the morning as family members with different perspectives, and were ending it as adversaries preparing for legal battle. This doesn't have to be a war, Veronica said. No, it doesn't, but if it becomes one, I'm prepared to fight it. She nodded once, opened her umbrella and walked out into the rain without another word. I closed the door behind her and leaned against it for a moment, listening to her car start and drive away, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle around me like a heavy coat. The conversation with Veronica had clarified several things. First, that the discovery of my assets hadn't changed her fundamental assessment of my capabilities. She still believed I needed management and supervision, just for different reasons than she'd originally thought. Second, that she and Marcus were prepared to escalate their efforts to control my life, potentially including legal challenges to my competency. Third, that the battle lines were now clearly drawn, and any hope of resolving this through family discussion and compromise was probably gone. But it had also confirmed something else: that I had resources and legal protections they hadn't anticipated, that I wasn't the vulnerable elderly woman they'd assumed I was, and that their efforts to override my autonomy were going to be more difficult and expensive than they'd imagined. I spent the rest of the morning reviewing the financial documents David had prepared, checking the balances in my various accounts, and making sure all my legal protections were properly documented and filed. By noon, I had a clear picture of my position. The $8 million in investments were protected in a trust that couldn't be touched by anyone other than myself, with clear instructions about what should happen if I became incapacitated. My house was protected by a homestead exemption that would prevent anyone from forcing me to sell it to pay for care I didn't want. My medical directives were specific about my wishes regarding treatment, end-of-life care, and who had authority to make decisions if I couldn't make them myself. Most importantly, I had documentation from 3 different doctors, including Dr. Chen at Sloan Kettering, confirming that I was mentally competent to make my own decisions, that my cognitive function was normal, and that there was no medical reason why I couldn't continue living independently. If Marcus and Veronica wanted to challenge my competency in court, they'd have to overcome substantial evidence that I was exactly what I claimed to be, a mentally competent adult, making reasonable decisions about my own life with full understanding of the risks and benefits involved. That afternoon, Tyler called. "Grandma Sandy, Mom said you went to New York yesterday to see a doctor." "I did. I wanted to get a second opinion about my treatment. Are you okay? Did the doctor say you're getting better?" The concern in his voice was genuine and innocent, untainted by the power struggles and control issues that had poisoned my relationships with his parents. He was simply a 10-year-old boy who loved his grandmother and wanted to know she was going to be all right. "The doctor said my treatment is going very well and that I'm responding better than many people with my condition." "That's good. Mom and Dad seem really worried about you." "They are worried. Sometimes adults worry about things they don't need to worry about." "Are you coming to my soccer game this weekend?" I thought about the conversation with Veronica about the threats and ultimatums and the battle lines being drawn between us. Tyler's soccer game would be neutral territory, but it would also be an opportunity for more confrontation, more pressure, more attempts to convince me that I was making poor decisions. "I'd like to come to your soccer game. Let me talk to your parents about the details." "Okay, and Grandma Sandy, I hope you keep feeling better." "Thank you, sweetheart. I love you." "I love you too." After Tyler hung up, I sat in my living room thinking about family loyalties, and the ways that serious illness changes relationships and the difference between helping someone and controlling them. Tyler loved me unconditionally, without agenda or judgment or concern about my financial status. His parents loved me too, but their love had become entangled with anxiety and control and assumptions about what was best for me. The question was whether there was still a way to preserve the relationships that mattered while protecting myself from the relationships that had become destructive. That evening, Marcus called. "Mom, Veronica told me about your conversation this morning." "I'm sure she did. She's upset. She feels like you're pushing us away, shutting us out of important decisions." "I'm maintaining appropriate boundaries. But we're family. We should be involved in decisions about your health, your living situation, your future planning." I could hear the frustration in his voice, but also something else, uncertainty maybe, or the beginning of doubt about the approach he and Veronica had been taking. "Why should you be involved in those decisions?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "Because we love you. Because we want to help. Because if something happens to you, we're the ones who'll have to deal with the consequences." "What consequences?" "Funeral arrangements, estate management." Explaining to Tyler why his grandmother died alone because she was too stubborn to accept help. The conversation was following a familiar pattern: love expressed as anxiety, anxiety justified as responsibility, responsibility used to claim authority over my choices. But there was something different in Marcus's tone, something that suggested he was beginning to question the logic of his own arguments. "Marcus, do you think I'm mentally competent to make my own decisions?" Another long silence. "Yes," he said finally, "I think you're competent. But I also think you're scared and stubborn and not thinking clearly about risk." "What if I am scared and stubborn? What if I am willing to accept more risk than you're comfortable with? Does that give you the right to override my choice?" "It gives me the responsibility to try to protect you from making dangerous mistakes, even if I don't want to be protected. Even if you don't want to be protected." There it was, finally stated clearly. Marcus believed he had not just the right, but the responsibility to protect me from my own choices, regardless of my wishes, regardless of my competency, regardless of my clearly expressed preferences about how I wanted to live. Then we have a fundamental disagreement about autonomy and family responsibility, I said, and I'm not sure how to resolve it. Mom, I just want you to be safe. I know you do, but I want to be free more than I want to be safe, and that's my choice to make. What if your choice is wrong? Then I'll live with the consequences of being wrong, or I'll die with them. Either way, they'll be my consequences to live with, or die with. Marcus was quiet for a long time, long enough that I began to think he might be starting to understand my perspective, might be beginning to see the difference between supporting someone's choices and making choices for them. I don't know how to stop worrying about you, he said finally. You don't have to stop worrying. You just have to stop using your worry as justification for controlling me. How do I do that? It was the first time in months that Marcus had asked me how to do something rather than telling me what I should do, and it gave me hope that maybe, despite everything that had happened, our relationship could still be salvaged. You support my choices even when you disagree with them. You offer help when I ask for it, not when you think I need it. You respect my right to take risks you wouldn't take, to live differently than you would live, and if something happens to you because of a choice I could have prevented you from making, then you grieve for me and remember that I died living as myself rather than living as your version of me. That's a terrible thing to ask of someone who loves you. It's the only thing that makes love different from possession. The conversation ended without resolution, but also without ultimatums or threats. Marcus was struggling with the same questions that had been driving his behavior for months, but for the first time he seemed willing to consider that his answers might not be the only valid one. Over the next few days I settled into a routine that felt more normal than anything I'd experienced since my diagnosis. I attended my rescheduled chemotherapy appointment, where Dr. Peterson confirmed that my treatment was proceeding exactly as planned. I had lunch with my friend Margaret from church, who listened to an abbreviated version of my family situation, and offered the kind of uncomplicated support that comes from decades of friendship. I worked in my garden preparing the soil for spring planting, and feeling the satisfaction that comes from nurturing growth, from participating in the cycles of renewal that continue regardless of human drama. I read books, paid bills, cooked meals for one, and lived exactly the kind of independent life that Marcus and Veronica had been arguing I couldn't sustain. On Thursday I met with David Rothstein to review the legal protections he'd prepared. These documents establish your competency through multiple medical evaluations, he explained, spreading papers across his conference table. They specify your wishes regarding medical care, living arrangements, and financial management. They designate trusted individuals to make decisions if you become unable to make them yourself, and they include specific language preventing anyone from overriding your choices, based on family relationships, or claims of superior judgment. What if someone challenges them? They'd have to prove that you were mentally incompetent when you signed them, and they'd have to overcome the medical evidence we've gathered. It's possible but expensive and difficult and unlikely to succeed, and if someone tries to have me declared incompetent, the same standard applies. They'd need clear medical evidence of cognitive impairment, and we have clear medical evidence of cognitive competence, plus the burden of proof would be on them to demonstrate that legal intervention is necessary. I signed the documents, feeling a sense of relief that went beyond simple legal protection. For the first time since my diagnosis, I felt truly secure in my right to make my own choices, truly confident that no one could override my decisions based on their assessment of my limitation. There's one more thing, David said, as I prepared to leave. You mentioned that your family might escalate their efforts to control your living situation. If they do, if they make any formal moves to challenge your competency or your right to live independently, I want you to call me immediately. What would you do? Whatever is necessary to protect your autonomy, including, if needed, pursuing harassment charges against anyone who continues to interfere with your legally protected rights. I drove home feeling more secure than I had in months, but also sad. The legal protections were necessary, but they were also evidence of how far my relationships with Marcus and Veronica had deteriorated. I was protecting myself against my own family, preparing for legal battles with people who claimed to love. That evening, as I was reading in my living room, A car pulled into my driveway. Through the window I could see Marcus getting out alone, without Veronica, walking slowly toward my front door like someone approaching a difficult conversation he'd been dreading. I let him in without speaking, leading him to the kitchen where we'd had so many conversations over the years, where he'd done homework as a child, and told me about his first job, and introduced me to Veronica, and shared the news that Tyler was on the way. "Mom," he said, settling into the chair across from me, "I've been thinking about what you said the other night, about autonomy and family responsibility and the difference between helping and controlling, and I think maybe I've been approaching this wrong. Maybe we've been approaching this wrong." I waited, letting him find his own words, not wanting to interrupt what might be the beginning of real understanding. "I love you," he said simply. "I love you, and I'm scared of losing you, and I think that fear has made me try to control things I can't control and shouldn't control. Fear makes people do things they wouldn't normally do, but that doesn't excuse it, and it doesn't make it right." He looked older than his 37 years, tired in the way that comes from wrestling with difficult truths about yourself, from recognizing that your intentions don't always justify your actions. "I want to try to do better," he said. "I want to find a way to support you without trying to manage you, but I don't know how to stop worrying. Worry is normal. Acting on worry by trying to control other people isn't normal. How do I tell the difference?" I thought about the question, about the months of pressure and manipulation and systematic undermining of my autonomy, about the difference between offering help and demanding compliance. "Ask yourself whether you're trying to support my choices or change them," I said. "Ask yourself whether you're responding to what I've asked for, or what you think I need. Ask yourself whether you're treating me like a capable adult or like a problem that needs solving." Marcus nodded slowly, apparently processing this framework, apparently trying to apply it to his own behavior over the past few months. "I think I've been treating you like a problem that needs solving," he said quietly. "Yes, you have, and that's not okay, even if my intentions were good." "No, it's not okay." We sat in silence for a few minutes, the weight of acknowledgement and apology hanging in the air between us. It wasn't a complete resolution. There would still be conversations about boundaries and expectations, and the ways our relationship would need to change going forward, but it was a beginning. "What about Veronica?" I asked. Marcus's expression darkened slightly. "Veronica is having a harder time with this. She's convinced that you're making dangerous choices, and that we have a responsibility to intervene. She's been researching legal options for challenging your right to live independently, so my instincts had been correct." Veronica was preparing for legal battle, convinced that my refusal to accept her management was evidence of impaired judgment rather than evidence of different values and priorities. "What kind of legal options?" "Guardianship proceeding, competency evaluation, arguments that your illness has impaired your judgment, and that you need legal protection from your own decisions. And what do you think about that?" Marcus looked at me across the kitchen table, really looked at me, apparently seeing me clearly for the first time in months. "I think you're the same person you've always been. I think you're dealing with cancer with the same intelligence and determination you've brought to everything else in your life. I think your judgment is sound, even when your choices are different from the choices I would make." "Then we're going to be okay," I said. "You and I are going to be okay, but you and Veronica aren't." "No, Veronica and I are not going to be okay." The legal papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who asked me to sign for them with the kind of professional courtesy that suggested he had no idea he was delivering a declaration of war between family members. I signed my name on the electronic pad, accepted the thick manila envelope, and closed the door with hands that were steadier than I'd expected them to be. In my kitchen I opened the envelope carefully and spread the documents across the table. Petition for guardianship, medical evaluation request, statement of concerned family members, financial assessment document, page after page of legal language that boiled down to one simple claim: Sandra Miller was no longer competent to manage her own affairs, and needed the court to appoint someone else to make decisions for her. The petitioner was listed as Veronica Andrews, acting on behalf of concerned family members. Marcus's name appeared on several of the supporting documents, though I noticed his signature looked hesitant, less confident than his usual bold handwriting. Tyler wasn't mentioned at all, which was probably for the best. I read through the papers twice, noting the careful language, the strategic arguments,
the way my cancer diagnosis and age were presented as evidence of diminished capacity rather than medical conditions I was managing successfully. The petition painted a picture of a confused elderly woman making dangerous financial decisions, refusing necessary medical supervision, and isolating herself from family members who were trying to help. It was a compelling narrative, if you didn't know the actual fact. I set the papers aside and called David Rothstein. "They've filed," I said when his secretary put me through. "Guardianship petition?" "Yes, Veronica Andrews is the petitioner. Marcus is listed as a supporting family member. I'll need to see the documents. Can you bring them in this afternoon?" "Of course, Sandy. I want you to know that this is exactly what we prepared for. We have all the medical documentation we need to refute their claims. Your cognitive evaluations are recent and thorough. Your financial management is documented and reasonable."
They're destroying you. Sandy, you need to get out of there. Come, stay with me until this legal nonsense is resolved. The idea was tempting. Arizona sunshine, Helen's uncomplicated support, distance from the daily stress of living under siege from people who claim to love me. "Let me think about it," I said. "Don't think too long. You're dealing with cancer and chemotherapy and legal battles and family drama all at the same time. That's more stress than anyone should handle." Over the next few days I made my decision. I wasn't running away from the legal battle. I was choosing the battlefield. Instead of defending my competency while living under siege in my own home, I'd defend it while living peacefully with my sister. Friday afternoon I was packing my suitcase when Tyler called. "Grandma Sandy. Dad said you're going to visit Aunt Helen for a while." "That's right. I want to spend some time with her while I'm feeling well enough to travel." "Are you coming back?" The question, asked with the innocent directness that only children possess, cut straight to the heart of my uncertainty. "I hope so," I said honestly. "But I don't know yet. I'll miss you." "I'll miss you too, sweetheart. But we'll talk on the phone, and maybe you can visit me in Arizona sometime." Saturday morning, I loaded my suitcase into my car and drove to Newark Airport. This time, I was taking a commercial flight to Phoenix, where Helen would pick me up. This time, there was no family drama about my travel arrangements, no questions about my competency. The flight to Phoenix was uneventful. 3.5 hours of reading and thinking. Helen was waiting at baggage claim with a huge smile and a welcome to Arizona sign that made me laugh for the first time in weeks. "You look terrible," she said, hugging me tightly. "But you're here, and that's what matters." Helen's apartment in Scottsdale was everything mine in New Jersey wasn't. Small, simple, designed for one person who valued convenience over memories. The whole space felt like a place where someone could live lightly, without the weight of accumulated history. That evening, we sat on Helen's small patio drinking wine and watching the sunset paint the desert mountains in shades of pink and gold. "You know what I think?" Helen said. "I think you're handling this exactly right. You're not running away from the problem. You're refusing to let the problem consume your life." Sunday morning, I woke up feeling more rested than I had in months. I sat on the patio with my coffee, reading the Sunday paper and feeling the sun warm my face. For the first time since my cancer diagnosis, I wasn't thinking about treatments or family conflicts. I was just enjoying a quiet morning in a beautiful place. The peace was interrupted by my phone ringing. "Marcus. Mom, where are you?" "In Arizona, visiting Helen." "But what about the court proceedings? What about the evaluations? What about them?" "I'll participate in whatever the court requires. Geography doesn't affect my ability to respond to legal proceedings." "Veronica says this looks like you're fleeing from the situation." I took a deep breath, looking out at the desert landscape, feeling the morning sun on my face. "Marcus, I'm not fleeing from anything. I'm choosing to spend my time in a place where I'm treated with respect rather than suspicion." Helen returned from church with groceries and plans for the week. A visit to the botanical garden, lunch with some of her friends, a trip to a nearby spa. "You're going to love Dr. Williams," she said. "He's the oncologist I arranged for you to see. He trained at Sloan Kettering actually." "When is the appointment?" "Tuesday morning." "Tuesday morning." Helen drove me to my appointment with Dr. Williams. His office was in a modern medical complex that specialized in oncology, with a patient-centered approach that was immediately apparent. Williams spent nearly an hour reviewing my medical history, examining me, and discussing my treatment protocol. "Your care in New Jersey has been excellent," he said finally. "Your response to treatment is very good, and there's no reason why you can't continue the same protocol here." And my cognitive function. Dr. Williams looked at me carefully, apparently wondering why I was asking about cognition during an oncology consultation. "Your cognitive function appears completely normal. Is there some reason you're concerned?" I explained about the guardianship petition, about my family's claims that my judgment was impaired. Dr. Williams listened with obvious dismay, occasionally shaking his head. "Mrs. Miller, I want to be very clear about this. There is absolutely no medical evidence to support claims that your judgment is impaired. Cancer doesn't automatically affect cognitive function, and chemotherapy side effects don't include severe cognitive impairment. Would you be willing to document that assessment?" "Absolutely. Anyone who claims otherwise is either medically ignorant or deliberately misrepresenting your condition." I left Dr. Williams's office feeling vindicated. Another expert had confirmed my competency. The following week brought legal activity. David filed our counter petition. Veronica's lawyers responded with additional documentation, and the court scheduled the preliminary hearing for the following month. I participated in all of it from Arizona, reviewing documents by email and maintaining detailed records of my daily activities. I also settled into a routine in Scottsdale that felt surprisingly natural. Chemotherapy appointments, lunch dates with Helen's friends, quiet mornings reading, evening walks. It was a simpler life than the one I'd left in New Jersey, but it was also more peaceful. Marcus called every few days with increasingly desperate attempts to convince me to return to New Jersey. "Mom, she's willing to drop the guardianship petition if you'll agree to move to assisted living." "I'm not agreeing to anything. I'm letting the court decide whether her petition has merit. But this could all be over if you just compromise, Marcus. The only compromise Veronica is offering is for me to give up my independence in exchange for her dropping a legal action that shouldn't have been filed in the first place. That's not compromise. That's extortion." The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in early April. I would participate by video conference from David's office in Scottsdale. Veronica and her lawyers would appear in person at the courthouse in New Jersey. The night before the hearing, Helen and I had dinner at a quiet restaurant. "How are you feeling about tomorrow?" she asked. "Ready. Nervous, but ready." "What's the best-case scenario?" "The judge dismisses the guardianship petition as frivolous and I'm free to continue living my life without legal interference. Either way, you're going to be fine. You're one of the strongest people I know, and you're fighting for something that matters." The hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m. Eastern Time, 8 a.m. in Arizona. I arrived at David's colleague's office early, dressed in the navy blue suit I'd brought from New Jersey, carrying a folder with all my medical documentation. At exactly 10 a.m., the hearing began. I could see the courtroom on my screen, the judge at her bench, Veronica and her lawyer at one table, David at another table, and Marcus sitting in the gallery looking uncomfortable. David stood and began methodically demolishing the case against me. He presented the medical evaluations confirming my cognitive competency, the documentation of my responsible financial management, the evidence of my appropriate medical compliance. "Your Honor," David concluded, "this petition is not based on evidence of incompetence. It's based on family disagreement about lifestyle choices. The petitioner may not like Mrs. Miller's decisions, but disliking someone's choices is not grounds for guardianship." Veronica's lawyer responded by arguing that my cancer diagnosis created cognitive impairment that I was unable to recognize, that my recent financial decisions demonstrated poor judgment, and that my refusal to accept family help proved I wasn't thinking clearly. It was a weak argument, unsupported by medical evidence. The judge asked Veronica's lawyer if he had any medical documentation to support his claims about my cognitive impairment. "Your Honor, we believe Mrs. Miller's recent behavior demonstrates cognitive decline." "Do you have medical evidence of cognitive decline?" "We believe the behavior speaks for itself. I didn't ask what you believe. I asked if you have medical evidence. Not at this time, Your Honor. The judge turned to the video screen where I was visible. Miss Miller, I'd like to ask you a few questions directly. Of course, Your Honor. Can you tell me why you arranged for medical transport to Sloan Kettering? I wanted a second opinion about my cancer treatment from one of the best cancer centers in the country. The medical transport was necessary because I wanted medical supervision during travel, given my condition, and the cost of that transport, $18,000, which I could easily afford. How could you afford it? I have approximately $8 million in investment accounts, Your Honor. The cost of the medical transport represented less than 0.25% of my assets. The judge made notes, then asked about my current living situation, my medical care, and my understanding of my legal rights. I answered every question clearly and thoroughly. After 20 minutes of questions, the judge asked both legal teams if they had anything else to add. David stood again. Your Honor, we respectfully request that this petition be dismissed as frivolous, and that Mrs. Miller be awarded attorney's fees for defending against it. The judge was quiet for several minutes, reviewing the documents. Finally, she looked up. I find no evidence that Miss Miller is unable to manage her own affairs or make her own decisions. Her cognitive function appears normal, her financial management appears responsible, and her medical compliance appears appropriate. This petition appears to be an attempt to use the legal system to resolve a family disagreement, which is not the purpose of guardianship proceedings. My heart started beating faster, therefore I am dismissing the petition for guardianship. Furthermore, I am awarding Miss Miller attorney's fees in the amount of $15,000, to be paid by the petitioner within 30 days. It was over. I had won, completely and decisively. On the screen I could see Veronica's face, pale with shock and anger. Marcus looked relieved. David was smiling. Miss Miller, the judge said, addressing me directly, you are free to continue living your life as you see fit. No one has the right to override your decisions simply because they disagree with them. Thank you, Your Honor. After the hearing ended, I sat in the Arizona office feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion. David called within minutes. Congratulations, that was about as decisive a victory as we could have hoped for. What happens now? Now you live your life. The court has confirmed your competency and your right to make your own decisions. Veronica can't file another guardianship petition without new evidence of incapacity, which she doesn't have and won't get. That afternoon, Helen and I celebrated with lunch at her favorite restaurant. We toasted my victory with iced tea, and shared a piece of chocolate cake. So what's next? Helen asked. I don't know. For the first time in months, I actually have choices. What are your options? I could go back to New Jersey. The house is still there, my life is still there. But the relationships, I trailed off. Or I could stay here, start over, build a new life in a place where people see me as competent and capable. What does your heart tell you? I thought about the question seriously. My heart told me that I was 72 years old with cancer, and I didn't have time to waste on relationships that drained my energy or situations that made me unhappy. My heart told me that I'd found peace in Arizona, that Helen's uncomplicated love and support had given me something I hadn't even realized I was missing. My heart tells me to stay, then stay. That evening, I called Tyler. Grandma Sandy, Dad told me you won in court. I did, sweetheart. The judge said I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions. Does that mean you're coming home? It means I can come home if I want to, but I'm thinking about staying in Arizona for a while longer. Why? Because I'm happy here, because Aunt Helen takes good care of me, because sometimes adults need to make changes in their lives to be healthy and happy. Will I still see you? Of course you will. You can visit me here, and I'll visit New Jersey sometimes. Distance doesn't change how much I love you. The next morning, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to a real estate agent in New Jersey, asking her to put my house on the market. The second was to David Rothstein, asking him to arrange for Tyler's educational trust to be funded immediately. $2 million? David asked. $2 million? I want to make sure his future is secure, regardless of what happens between his parents and me. That's very generous. It's practical. Tyler is the one good thing to come out of this whole mess. I want to protect him. Over the next few weeks, I settled permanently into life in Arizona. I found a small apartment in Helen's retirement community, transferred my medical care completely to Dr. Williams, and began building new routines and friendships. Marcus called occasionally, usually to update me on Tyler's activities, or to share news about his own life. He never again questioned my competency or my choices. Veronica and I had no contact at all, which suited both of us perfectly. The house in New Jersey sold quickly, for more than I'd expect. The proceeds went into my investment accounts, growing the nest egg that would fund whatever care I might need in the future. 3 months after the court hearing, Tyler flew to Arizona to spend a week with me. It was his first solo trip, and he was nervous but excited about the adventure. "This place is so different from home," he said as we walked through the desert botanical garden. "Different can be good," I said. "Sometimes people need different environments to be their best selves." "Are you your best self here?" I thought about the question as we paused beside a flowering ocotillo, its bright red blooms reaching toward the desert sky. "I think I am. I'm not worried all the time. I'm not fighting with people I love. I'm just living my life and enjoying each day." "Mom says you abandoned the family. What do you think?" Tyler considered this seriously, with the kind of careful thought that reminded me he was growing up, becoming capable of forming his own opinions about complex situations. "I think you protected yourself from people who were trying to control you." "That doesn't seem like abandoning. That seems like being smart. You're going to be okay, you know that?" "I know you made sure of that." "What do you mean?" "Dad told me about the money you set aside for college. He said I'll never have to worry about paying for school or getting the education I want." "That's right. Your education will always be secure no matter what happens." "Thank you, Grandma Sandy. You don't have to thank me for loving you." On Tyler's last night in Arizona, we sat on my small patio watching the sunset and talking about his plans for the future, his interests in science and computers, his dreams of traveling and learning, and making his own mark on the world. "Will you be okay without me?" he asked as we prepared for bed. "I'll be fine, but I'll miss you." "I'll miss you too, but I'll come back. I know you will." A year later I was sitting on the same patio, reading a book and enjoying the warm morning sun, when my phone rang. Dr. Williams with the results of my latest scan. "The tumors continue to shrink," he said. "Your response to treatment has been exceptional. I'm cautiously optimistic that we're looking at long-term remission." Long-term remission. The words I'd been hoping to hear since my diagnosis, the possibility I'd fought for through chemotherapy and family conflicts and legal battles. How long-term? Years potentially. With continued monitoring and maintenance therapy, there's no reason you can't have many more years of good health. After I hung up, I sat in the desert sunshine, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment, the cancer diagnosis that had triggered everything, the family conflicts that had forced me to choose between autonomy and security, the legal battle that had confirmed my right to make my own choices, the move to Arizona that had given me peace and happiness. A year ago I'd been a woman fighting for her life and her freedom. Today, I was a woman who had won both battles. Helen appeared on the patio with 2 cups of coffee and her crossword puzzle. "Good news?" she asked, noting my expression. "The best. Continued remission, possibly years more of good health." "Then we'd better make plans. I was thinking we should take that trip to Santa Fe we've been talking about." "When?" "Next month, while you're feeling strong and the weather is perfect." I smiled, thinking about road trips and art galleries and the luxury of making plans for the future. For the first time in over a year I could think beyond the next medical appointment, beyond the next treatment cycle, beyond the immediate crisis of cancer and family drama. "Yes," I said, "let's go to Santa Fe. Let's go everywhere." That afternoon, I called Tyler to share the good news about my medical results. He was in his sophomore year of high school now, thriving academically and socially, making plans for college applications and future careers. "Does this mean you're cured?" he asked. "It means I'm in remission, which is the next best thing. It means we'll have many more years together." "Good. I was worried about you." "You don't have to worry about me anymore. I'm exactly where I need to be, doing exactly what I need to do, with exactly the people who love and support me unconditionally." "Are you happy, Grandma Sandy?" "I'm very happy.
happier than I've been in years. Then I'm happy too. After Tyler hung up, I sat on my patio in the gathering dusk, thinking about happiness and health, and the choices that had led me to this peaceful desert evening. I thought about the $8 million that had given me options, about the legal battle that had confirmed my rights, about the family relationships that had been damaged, and the new relationships that had flourished. Most of all, I thought about freedom, the freedom to choose where to live, and how to live, and who to include in my life, the freedom to make decisions based on my own values, rather than other people's fear, the freedom to be myself, completely and unapologetically, for whatever years remained to me. It had been worth fighting for, it was worth everything. The stars were beginning to appear in the clear desert sky, visible in a way they never were in suburban New Jersey. I sat quietly, watching them emerge one by one, thinking about new beginnings and second chances, and the unexpected gifts that sometimes emerge from life's most difficult challenges. Tomorrow I would continue building the life I'd chosen for myself, but tonight, I was simply grateful to be exactly where I belonged, surrounded by people who valued my independence, rather than trying to diminish it, living on my own terms in a place that felt like home. I had won more than a legal battle, I had won back myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.